Um, Last week we started a series. I called it Overcomer, and I told you, I said I'm a little leery of the title. I think it's a good title. I think it works. I think it's especially pertinent. But I get a little worried whenever we start something that makes it sound like, almost makes it promise like this is going to turn into some kind of motivational hour. If you don't know where you are with Christ, if you're here this morning and you're just kind of still questioning a lot of things, I want you to be right at home. I want you to feel comfortable. We like questions around here. But for those of us who are seeking to follow Christ along the way, the overcomer piece for us, we don't think of it as a motivational time, because if life was just that easy, we would turn it into little catchphrases and slangs, and it would just work really, really well. And I could be a motivational speaker, and I might make more money at it too. But my take, and I think probably your take, if you've been alive more than 2 weeks in this world, is that life's just not really, really easy. Life's a whole lot of mess, and in the mess, the slangs don't always work, right? The little catchphrases don't always carry us through. They're good sometimes. I'm not going to downplay motivational speakers, but sometimes you need a little more something, right? It just isn't so easy to have a little motivational phrase that you put on your window or with a cat picture on it. My favorite is when I go to the dentist and you lay down. Anybody have a dentist that puts like cat pictures on the ceiling so you're staring at I guess it's supposed to make you feel better. Be motivated that you're there. Motivates me to brush my teeth. I don't want the dentist in my mouth, but that's just the way I am. It's just messy. Life is hard. Life is messy. So this is not about motivational stuff. This is about, hopefully, fighting the unhealthy views that we say to ourselves, that go on, the conversations in our head on a weekly basis. Because for most of us, that's where the battle happens, right? We get in, and we get into the week, and all of a sudden we start to hear or say or listen, or things come from our past, and they start to speak to us, and they're just unhealthy views of us as people. Last week we talked about the unhealthy view of comparison, how sometimes we compare ourselves in ways that are not good for us. And I made this statement, please, I don't take credit for it, I can't license it, trust me, it's been said before. I made this statement, though, that comparison kills contentment. That if you allow yourself to get pulled into a long dialogue of comparing yourself all the time, that it's going to be really, really hard to be content in life, right? Because the second you take your eyes off of your own personality, your own stuff, your place in life, your talents, the things God has gifted you and wired you for, the second you start to desire and drive and seek to possess somebody else's stuff or even their personality, you're not going to be content. The more you compare, the less content you are. And I even made the statement, and because you guys who have been with me for a while know how I like to mash things together, but in our Insta Snapbook world, right? You understand what that means? Insta Snapbook world. In our Insta Snapbook world, we are constantly comparing things, especially ourselves. And the problem is that we compare our whole life, right, to everybody else's highlights in the moment. We compare our whole life to everybody else's highlights. We compare what's this really great moment that they experienced last week, and they snapped a picture of it, and they put a filter on it, and they dropped it out there in the interweb world, and it just made it look like their life is glorious. And we looked at it through the lens of what? Dirty diapers, laundry, right? The fight you had this morning with your spouse, the projects that are late at work. We look at those snapshots through our whole lives, and we get discontent, right? We experience that discontentment because we're focusing on everybody else's highlights, and we're looking at it through all of our whole life together. Listen, we said last week, here was the truth. We said that when God created you, He didn't compare you to anybody else, right? He created you for Himself. That was the truth we wound up with. Now, whether you believe in God or not, or whether you're on this journey, you're trying to figure it out, the truth is for those of us who follow Christ, that's what we hold on to. That when God created you, He didn't compare you to other people when He created you for Himself. So your stature, right, whether you're tall or short, your personality, how you're wired, the way you process information, how you see the world, all of those things are God's gift when He wired you, made you like you are. And the only thing comparison's going to do is invite you to be dissatisfied with that. And when you're dissatisfied with that, what happens? You're going to hustle, you're going to push, you're going to focus, and you're going to put your eyes on somebody else, some other thing, and you're just never going to be satisfied. When we compare ourselves to everybody else, we are completely dissatisfied with life. That's where I want to start again this morning. I want to start because when we do that, something else happens. We actually will surrender a portion of our identity when we begin to compare at that level. 2 summers ago, the Linky family got back from vacation. Some of you heard part of this story before. We had put as we normally do, we put our mail on hold so it would stay at the post office while we were on vacation. We got back, and about a week in, realized our mail had been stolen from the post office. That's not a good thing. Along with that, we began to wrestle with what some of you have already wrestled with, which has become very popular in our culture, or I say popular, it's something that happens to a lot of people. We began to wrestle with our stolen identity. That somebody had stolen enough of our mail, enough of our electronic information, that they were able to assume our identity in such a way that they could get credit. And they started charging bills, charging for things that they wanted in life. I was thinking about this week, and okay, so you know more about me. I immediately think of an episode of Friends. If you don't watch Friends, I've got them all on DVD, the whole season. So, right, all of them. So you just come on over, I'll put it in, and we'll talk about all the spiritual meaning from the show Friends. But in Friends, there's an episode where Monica, somebody steals her identity. And the funny thing is, when she hunts around enough, she kind of becomes her own little private investigator. She discovers who it is. And once she finds out who it is, she starts following them. And then she gets mad because this person is charging all this stuff to her credit, but this person is actually enjoying like her best life. This person is doing all the things that Monica's too afraid to do, and it's exciting, and she gets jealous of this person who's stolen her identity. When we found out what was happening with our identity, we actually found out that somebody had charged $1,100 of racing fuel to our credit. That sounds cool to me. I'm here to tell you that was as far as the cool went, though. It takes a lot of work to undo when somebody steals your credit. And here's the thing. When somebody steals your credit today, there's a whole line of businesses that have evolved from that problem to help you unwind it. And they're not doing this on purpose. This is a need today. But the problem is when somebody steals your credit, it actually opens you up to a whole other line of feelings and emotions. You get a little paranoid at times. You get a little fearful. You stop handing out your information. You start checking your mailbox a lot more. You get a little more stressed. And ultimately, you know what happens? You lose some of your freedom. You lose some of your freedom. When somebody steals your identity, they possess enough private information, at least electronically. Listen, nobody can really steal your identity, right? You know that. I mean, you're still you. We were still us. But they had our electronic presence enough that they could act like us in that world, and they could ruin our lives. They could convince others. They could deceive. And ultimately, what happens is if they have your identity, they can destroy your destiny. They can destroy your future. And that's no lie. And so there's this fear that comes up. Listen, when you compare yourself to other people, you start to give away a portion of your identity. And when you give it away, you start to live in fear. You start to live with more stress. You start to experience discontentment like you've never experienced before. I want to take you to Ephesians real quick this morning. Paul writes this little letter to this group, this church in Ephesus. And I love Paul, and I love his writings, but he rambles a lot. So we're going to cover 2 little passages, but there's quite a few verses in each one, not a lot. But Paul writes to the Christians at Ephesus, and what he starts to do is he takes half of his letter, and he says, here's the thing. Here's what Jesus did for you. Right? So it's very theological. It's written so that everybody can understand their position in Christ, their new identity. Right? The second half of that letter, chapters 3 through 6, he actually will start to unpack what does it mean. What does it mean to practice that position in Christ, your new identity, as you grow together as Christians? I had a professor in seminary. He used to say this about the theme of Ephesians, and I love this, so I pulled it out. He said, Christians get along with each other. That's the theme. Christians get along with each other. Maintain the unity practically which Christ has effected positionally by his death. So practice what Christ has done for you. That's all he's saying. I want to look at Ephesians real quick. I want to go to chapter 2. So we're going to be in more of the theological section today. But don't worry, right? Okay, don't tense up on me. I say theology, and I know some of you, your eyes roll back in your head. It's like we're back in history class again. I'm going to go to the theology section because you have to understand what Christ has done for your identity. If you don't understand it, it's hard to practice it, right? Okay, Ephesians 2, we're going to start in verse 1. Paul writes, he says, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins. You Ephesian Christians, you followers of Jesus who were living in Ephesus, you were dead, past tense. You were, at one point in time, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. They weren't physically dead, right? He's writing a letter to them. They were alive. They weren't physically dead. They were spiritually dead. They were unable to affect any change on their relationship with God. In other words, they couldn't change their status with God. There's nothing they could do to earn God's favor. They were spiritually dead. You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, past tense, following what the course of this world. So whatever you practiced when you were dead is actually the practice of the world that you live in, following the prince of the power of the air, a fancy phrase for Satan who's in charge of this world at this point in certain aspects, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. He said, you guys, you once were this way. You had this other identity. You practiced your life in a way that was against God. It was opposite God. Verse 3. Among whom, watch this, we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. He says, you were this way. Oh, by the way, we, includes himself, includes the apostle, he includes everybody else now. He says, we all were that way. If we now follow Christ, we all used to be that way. There was no way out of it. Carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath. We were under God's judgment, like, now watch this, the rest of mankind. He says, you once were this way. We all were once this way if we follow Jesus now. But, oh, by the way, the mankind is still there. That under the judgment of God, mankind still operates in this old identity. Every religion has to deal with one specific thing in our world. What's wrong with mankind? It doesn't matter what religion it is, but somebody's got to have an answer somewhere. What's wrong? We know something is seriously wrong with mankind, right? We get that. The human race is broken in some way. Moses first wrote about it, right? God instructed Moses. Moses first wrote about it in Genesis, and he starts to take us back to what theologians will call original sin. That's a word we don't like today. It's a phrase we don't like. People wrestle with this. Original sin. As the result of Adam and Eve, who pursued creation over the Creator, right, identified themselves with wanting to pursue their own passion, their own lust, not walk with God the Creator, they fell into original sin, which took all of mankind down with them. David, the great king, made a statement in Psalm 51. He would talk about it this way. He said, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, a fancy word for sin, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, I have heard some crazy stuff around this verse. I've heard people say we shouldn't have kids. See, David was saying we shouldn't have kids. You're going to have kids. First of all, if you have kids, you understand why somebody might say that, right? They can be a little trying at times. But David is saying, look, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. He's not saying women shouldn't have babies. He's not saying it was sinful for him to be born. He's pointing to this thing we call original sin. He's acknowledging that mankind, humankind, is fallen from our birth. That we were born, and it continues to this day. Our identity without Jesus Christ is one of brokenness, sin, and fallenness. At the core of our nature, we're fallen. We're unable to restore our relationship with Christ. It doesn't mean, listen, it doesn't mean you are as bad as you could be. It doesn't mean that humanity is as bad as we could be. It doesn't even mean this. It doesn't mean that you can't improve yourself, right? That you don't have the skills and the talents to be able to actually kind of live a better life. It doesn't mean any of that. he's acknowledging that our identity, our very core, has been corrupted. One guy I like to talk about when I talk about this kind of thing is Hitler. I'm not going to take a hand count. I'm guessing everybody knows who Hitler is. I talk about him because I joke all the time, coming from a German Lutheran family, that we're trying, with a grandfather whose name was Adolf, we're trying to, redeem that name. One guy stole a perfectly good name and trashed it, but we're going to try to redeem it. Listen, we think of Hitler, and so many times we think he was just the essence of evil, right? But was Hitler as bad as he could have been? See, I tend to think that Hitler, somewhere in Hitler's life, he probably had affection for his mom. He had affection for somebody. I'm thinking that Hitler wasn't as bad as he could have been. You might argue with me, but I'm just saying that's the thing with total depravity. It's not saying that you are as bad as you could be. Your identity is not as bad as it could be. It's saying there's something broken within you. Think of it this way. You're not a sinner because you sin today. All right? You sin today because you're a sinner. Because your identity is broken. You at the core of who you are, original sin is we are going to pursue the creation over the Creator. That's who we're going to be. It's wired in us for humanity to want to pursue the creation over the Creator. That's what's broken with us. And the impact keeps continuing. It's affected your whole person, your whole being. It affects your mind, your thinking. Even as followers of Christ, we still live under some of the influence of this. Our minds can drift into evil areas. I love R.C. Sproul. He's one of my favorite theologians. He used to say it this way. He used to say, you're radically corrupted. You're radically corrupted. Our identity without Jesus is radically corrupted. The identity of mankind without Jesus is radically corrupted. That's who we are. That's who we are. It may not be as bad as we could be. May not be as bad as it might get one day, but we are without the ability to improve that stance before God. If you've not come to faith in Jesus Christ, you still can associate with this, right? You still can, and if you're a parent, this is going to be no surprise to you when we talk about this kind of thing. Why? Because as a parent, you don't ever have to teach your kid to be selfish. You don't have to teach them to lie. And if you think about it, as we talk about comparisons, you don't have to teach a teenager to compare themselves, do you? In fact, the social media world is wreaking havoc on young people as they compare their whole lives against somebody else's highlight, right? So, this is the truth. This is the truth. Mankind's identity is removed from God. Mankind's identity is one of incapable of helping himself in his stance before God. My passions and my priorities rise above Christ all the time as an unrepentant person. If I'm not aware of my change. Now, Paul's going to do something. He's going to now spend a few verses talking about the new identity. And he mashes these two together. Listen, so many times I think we come to church and we expect to hear this. We expect to hear how I need to be a better person. We expect to hear, I should feel more shame and guilt for who I am, right? The struggles I have. I don't see that anywhere in Paul's writings. Watch this in verse 4. Look what he does. He's going to set them up. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he has loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that, I want you to underline this phrase, we're going to come back to it, in the coming ages, he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. He doesn't try to guilt us. He doesn't try to shame us. Right? He's not saying, you just need to be better Christians. You need to perform better. He simply reminds us. He simply starts to point us back to a new identity that we get only because of the grace of God through Jesus Christ. Why? Because our identity is going to determine our destiny. Our identity is going to determine our destiny. Now, that applies to all of mankind, and some people may not believe that. You may not be completely there in believing me on that, but the identity that you possess when you leave this world is going to determine your destiny, your future. And in fact, it determines it so much, right, that right now it impacts your stance even in this life, right? If we embrace an identity of a humanity without God, we're going to pursue creation over the Creator. It's going to be natural within us. We're going to chase our personal passions, right? We're going to have this identity that's separate from God, and we're going to hold on to that identity even in this temporary life, right? That's going to be the thing we grab a hold on. Then, when we start to, with that identity will come more comparisons, more watching other people, more dissatisfaction, even more keeping up with the Joneses. Right? If we gravitate to that temporary identity that mankind is born under, and that's what we want to hold on to, we're going to suffer more comparison. It's going to be in us because it's going to be the thing we're always looking to improve ourselves. We're always going to be driven that way. Paul wants more for his new believers. He wants more for the church at Ephesus. So what does he do? He says, look at this person of God. Look at this identity that God is, who he is, rich in mercy. Put the verses back up if they're not up. Rich in mercy. He's rich in his desire to offer you forgiveness. He's rich in great love. You ever go to church and feel like that the only message sometimes is that we're just bad people and we need to be punished? See, when I read Paul, when I read the Old Testament, when I read the stories of the Bible, I see more than punishment. I see a God in pursuit of his people. Paul says he's rich in this great love. He loves you more than you probably could ever imagine. He loves you enough that he would sacrifice his son. And I've said this, and I'll go to my grave saying this. I don't know that I love you that much. I love my kids. I just can't imagine you saying you've got to offer your son for this other person. See, that doesn't register